Do you ever feel like the media is gaslighting you? Like they're barely even pretending not to have double standards? Like much of the misinformation the media warns us about comes from the media itself? Or like you're the only person on Twitter with a memory longer than 24 hours? You're not alone.
I felt like for a long time, I was the only person on the website with a memory longer than 24 hours. And I would see these things and think, I remember you saying the opposite moments ago.
That is Drew Holden. If you're on X, you may have already heard of him. He's kind of a little bit Twitter famous for being the keeper of receipts and maker of threads. In real life, he's a comms guy, former journalist, past hedge fund flameout, Capitol Hill staffer, and public affairs consultant. His current day job is as the managing editor of American Compass, a conservative think tank. But his online reputation is as a media critic, and he's a bit of a favourite of conservative pundits.
When he grabs onto a subject, he is an absolute bulldog. He is one of the best, I think, public affairs, political affairs, information watchdogs right now in all of social media.
He's got around 170,000 followers these days and seemingly around 170,000 screenshots of bad journalism up his sleeve. Drew's special skill is pulling out those receipts to throw the mainstream/corporate/liberal media's hypocrisy and failures right back in its face. And he's pretty good at it. He posts damning threads full of damning examples of the media's damn awful reporting. Let's start with a recent and frankly quite pertinent, I think, given the outcome of the US election, example of what he does.
Thread. Mere days before the election, the media, en masse, invented a conspiracy theory alleging Trump threatened Liz Cheney with violence. Below, you'll see what Trump actually said and how outlets decided to report it. Maybe the most dishonest coverage I can recall.
I'm sure you remember this story. You might have heard this version.
Donald Trump has been accused of using dangerous rhetoric after suggesting guns should be trained on the face of Republican critic Liz Cheney.
Or this version.
Suggesting putting her in front of a firing line.
Or this version.
Donald Trump was on Tucker Carlson and called for a 9-person firing squad to assassinate former Republican Congressman Liz Cheney.
Only that's not really what Trump said. Anyone who watched the comments Trump made in their full context could see that he was making a point about politicians who support wars not being the ones who have to put their lives on the line in those wars. It's a pretty well-worn criticism of so-called war hawks. And to make his point about the coverage this story got, Drew posted dozens of dubious news headlines right alongside the full transcript of Trump's quote.
Look at the quote. Then look at this headline from Washington Post. Does one follow the other?
I will play you the clip.
Is it weird for you to see Liz Cheney, that'd be Dick Cheney's repulsive little daughter, running against you with Kamala Harris?
Well, I think it hurts Kamala a lot, actually. Look, she's a deranged person. But the reason she couldn't stand me is that she always wanted to go to war with people. I don't want to go to war. She wanted to stay in Syria. I took them out. She wanted to stay in Iraq. I took them out. I mean, if it were up to her, we'd be in 50 different countries. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy.
Now, I'm not a fan of that kind of rhetoric. However, I am also not a fan of hyping shit up to the extent that its entire meaning changes. And I think journalists especially should not do that. So I was pretty dismayed to see the dozens of examples Drew produced from news outlets that really should have done a better job reporting on this. He had this from the Washington Post, this from the New York Times, CNN with this and this. He had this from the US Guardian, this from Roll Call, this from The Atlantic, this from Axios, and this from Politico. Some of the reporting Drew highlighted even framed the story as a Trump fantasy.
Trump fantasizes about shooting female rival in the face. Trump conjures up violent fantasy about Liz Cheney being shot at.
Now, it may seem like quibbling over whether Trump was suggesting or advocating or calling for or imagining or fantasizing, but bottom line, I agree with Drew's argument that those headlines do not fairly represent what Trump said.
And so you take out of context and you get this really flashy headline that I think sticks in people's brains, but it's not actually what the candidate is saying. And I think we ought to have at least a little bit of honesty on those things, right? You make a really good point that this always happens. Candidates are always taken out of context. Politicians are always taken out of context. But particularly on this Liz Cheney quote, he was very obviously making a point that's been made about Liz Cheney once upon a time from the left and from the media for decades, that she is a war hawk, that she supports wars she shouldn't, foreign conflicts she shouldn't. That's what Trump was saying. And if you pull out the quote, he says, let's imagine if she had to have the rifle in her hand, right? And instead, the only thing we get clipped out of that conversation is, well, though, he wants to train rifles on her face. And I think it is almost impossible to look at everything he said and think that that is the spirit of what he was trying to say. And I think that matters.
I totally agree that it matters. I think it matters a lot. For mine, this is exactly the kind of thing that plays right into the hands of Trump's supporters who say that he isn't treated fairly by the media, because that is an example of him not being treated fairly by the media. And I find it really hard to understand why news outlets keep doing this. Where I depart from Drew's take on this example, and frankly in many of his others, is in his conclusion.
You surely don't need me to connect the dots, but just in case. The mainstream media created a conspiracy theory to try to convince voters of the supposed threat of one of the candidates days before the election. Malpractice doesn't go far enough.
See, I think malpractice actually does go far enough. I mean, that's what it is. These publications are full of people who have been brain rotted by Trump. They genuinely think that's what he means, or they think, well, it's the kind of thing he might mean. Listen to this guy, Jonathan Alter. He's a liberal journalist who agrees Trump was taken out of context, but then pretty much says he had it coming because of the wider context.
I don't like seeing any politician being taken out of context.
Do you agree that's what happened in this case, John?
I think it did happen in this case, but the problem is gaffes always have to be seen in context.
It wasn't a gaffe. Donald Trump said exactly what he wanted to say.
No, it was a gaffe because gaffes are what are, it was let me just be clear about this.
Yeah.
It was taken out of context and that was wrong. But when I say gaffe, I mean incidents that can change, campaigns.
But
what are
seen
as gaffes.
Hold on. A gaffe would be like what happened with Joe Biden, where he didn't say what he intended to say. Donald Trump didn't commit a gaffe. He's not being punished for making a gaffe. Well, he said exactly what he wanted to say.
But the point that I was going to make is when these things land is when they're, even if they're really unfairly taken out of context, they land and affect things when they are resonant in a larger context. So Donald Trump has been using the language of violence. When you speak the language of violence, you're going to get screwed this way.
No,
it's going to happen.
I just think that is appalling reasoning, no matter who it's applied to. But when Drew Holden claims this is a conspiracy created by the media in an effort to influence the election, I mean, to me, that just seems like he's engaging in the same kind of hysteria he's trying to call out. I don't think this is a media conspiracy. I think this is just garden variety truthiness. Colbert identified this problem almost 20 years ago.
Truthiness. Now, I'm sure some of the word police, the wordinistas over at Webster's, are going to say, hey, that's not a word. Well, anybody who knows me know that I'm no fan of dictionaries or reference books. They're elitist, constantly telling us what is or isn't true or what did or didn't happen. I don't trust books. They're all fact, no heart. And that's exactly what's pulling our country apart today. We are divided between those who think with their head and those who know with their heart. Now, I know some of you may not trust your gut yet, but with my help, you will. The Truthiness is anyone can read the news to you. I promise to feel the news at you.
And just quickly, credit where it's due. This journo I showed you earlier, he wasn't on board the truthiness train.
Well, Fauzi, just to clarify, Mr. Trump wasn't talking about putting her in front of any sort of shooters or guns. He was saying that, calling her a war hawk. What he's essentially been saying is, what would it be like for her to have guns put in her face, that she's not really understanding what it's like to be an American soldier fighting in a foreign war.
Now, back to Drew Holden, who this review is meant to be about. While I disagree with his explanation for why this stuff happens, I appreciate the fact that he documents this stuff happening. I think it's a good thing to have on the record and to put in front of people, especially at a time, as he points out, when people have very, very short memories and there is very little accountability.
But I think that one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is that the discourse on different subjects, big, weighty subjects, emotionally charged and emotionally laden subjects, we move on blindingly quickly. And so whenever we have this big kind of flashbang of a media moment, even if it sizzles, no one's paying much attention to the correction coming down the pike 3 or 6 months later, a year later, what have you. And so what gets lost is you have all of these people consistently kind of screwing these sorts of things up, and there's no learning or lesson from it. When I think the best case scenario would be you screw up, you make corrections, the media ecosystem makes correction, and then they improve for next time. We're not having any of that looping on the back end.
So his Twitter threads are a small way of trying to bring that feedback loop back into the media ecosystem. He's done them for the media's coverage on the Kyle Rittenhouse case, pandemic lockdowns, the lab leak COVID theory, and of stories saying that claims of Joe Biden's cognitive decline were disinformation, something which I think in hindsight we can all agree they probably weren't.
Thread. Biden's disastrous debate performance brought to a screeching halt a multi-year campaign from the media to present the president as mentally fit. Do you really remember how hard the press pushed you not to trust your lion eyes on Biden's decline? Start here.
One of the best recap/reminder threads I think Drew's done was this one.
Do you really remember the Hunter Biden laptop story? I fear we've lost the plot.
Drew's thread and the piece he wrote on his Substack were really good reminders of just how outrageous that whole saga was. I mean, the fact that the emails really were real and really did come from Hunter Biden's laptop after almost the entire mainstream media told us that this was Russian disinformation, and the fact that the story was censored by social media companies was crazy. And it doesn't seem like there's been a huge amount of accountability on the part of those who got it wrong. Although I'm not sure I agree with Drew that the story should have been about corruption and abuse of power. No one's actually shown Joe Biden did anything wrong. Isn't this why Republicans gave up on the idea of impeaching him over it? Because the evidence just wasn't there?
GOP's Biden impeachment effort fizzles with reports release.
Just as a side note, one of my favourite receipts produced by Drew, just for sheer silliness, might be this one.
If you need help talking with the children in your life about the aftermath of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani's killing, Time for Kids has a guide to explaining the topic.
I know that guide helped me get through it with my kids. Another notable thread Drew's done was for the story about hospitals supposedly being overwhelmed with people suffering ivermectin overdoses, which you might remember from the COVID years. It turned out the story was bogus, but because it fit the narrative of idiots taking the bogus COVID cure of ivermectin, which, just to be clear, is a bogus COVID cure, but it got worldwide coverage with basically zero fact-checking.
I just really don't understand why seemingly real news outlets like Newsweek, NY Daily News, and The Hill didn't bother to even look into this story before they pushed this narrative. Didn't it sound odd? Wasn't it worth investigating? Maybe a single phone call?
Drew's frustration and incredulity at the media was palpable. He'd even found someone who was studying mis and disinformation who had shared this untrue story. And I share that frustration with him. But this example is one where he, again, I think, overreaches in his conclusion. conclusion.
It should go without saying, but inventing a narrative out of thin air simply because it confirms your priors is not going to help rebuild trust in the media.
The ivermectin overdoses story wasn't invented out of thin air. It was a fuck-up. CNN did a really good fact check and breakdown of how it happened. Basically, it had mutated from a local TV news report about hospital congestion in Oklahoma. Now, the report had misquoted a doctor they'd interviewed.
This story was then basically copied with little to no additional research by some bigger name national and international outlets, notably including Rolling Stone magazine. And it was promoted by some big name media figures on the left on Twitter, notably including MSNBC host Rachel Maddow.
And it just snowballed from there. My point is, these kinds of media failures are far more likely to come down to misunderstanding, laziness, or incompetence than to a malicious or deliberate intent to invent a narrative, which Drew is just a little bit too fond of claiming, in my opinion. And what's weird is I've seen him talking about this in interviews where he seems to acknowledge that these are usually just mistakes, which in his view are the result of newsrooms not really having enough of a diversity of political opinion among their staff.
Is it a lack of skepticism, or is it intentional, or is it both? I mean, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm open that I'm maybe just a little bit wet behind the ears on this stuff, but I do think that by and large, it's an error rather than something that's a little bit more deliberately kind of malignant. So I think what it really comes down to is that you have within newsrooms, within the average newsroom, or within the average editorial team, there's kind of this monochromatic view of the world and how it operates.
So, look, I'm not sure why he so often claims these things are like media conspiracies in his Twitter threads. But I'm still happy that Drew is doing what he does, and I'm happy that he's doing it on Twitter, because that's where the media and political class are. I think that's also why his threads can feel so satisfying. Most of us just rant and rave about this stuff at home to our long-suffering partners, or maybe that's just me. But he is saying it to the people who most need to hear it. Quite literally, he's tagging the outlets and the individual reporters in his tweets. Now, some of those journalists have blocked him, so I guess they're not going to hear it, but others have actually reached out to him.
So you're entertaining people on the right. Are you having any effect on anyone else, do you think?
That's a good question. So it's funny. I very rarely get people who I've called out who reply to me in any fashion. But one of the things that I do get pretty often is I get reporters from corporate outlets usually who I've taken down in these threads, who will reach out to me from time to time after and be like, ugh, yeah, that was bad. I don't know why we did that one. Or give me like a little bit of the inside gossip and kind of inside baseball. And so that's something that I think I really do appreciate. And one of the things that I want to be able to do is I want to be an avenue for those kind of disaffected journalists to come to me and say, and I've had people who have kind of like handed me documents and other things that have been like, this is preposterous, right? I can't write about it. I can't talk about it. I can't tweet about it. You can. And so I'm trying to be a conduit for some of the inside baseball that goes down on some of that stuff. And that's something I found to be really beneficial. And to me, it means that I'm striking a chord somewhere, right? That there's a reason there are these kind of moderate, regular, everyday journalists who are disaffected at the most esteemed publications in the country. And that to me means that obviously the thing that I'm doing is resonating somewhere and that there's something there to tap into.
So I think he's doing great work, but we need to talk about his bias. Now, he's open about the fact that he's a conservative, and once you've been following him for a while, it becomes pretty clear that his threads are pretty much exclusively targeted at the liberal or left-wing media.
I have my own views of the world and how it works and how it operates, and I don't think I'm particularly impartial. I try to be impartial, and I think I probably take more pains to be impartial than lots and lots of people who, like myself, talk too much on Twitter. But I'm not, in any meaningful sense, I think, I'm not unbiased in the way that I approach these issues.
But maybe he's not taking quite enough pains to be impartial, because I reckon he's a little bit guilty of indulging in some truthiness himself. Let me give you an example. Here he is on conservative commentator Megyn Kelly's show. They were talking about Tim Walz and complaining about the fawning media coverage of him, especially his famous characterization of Trump and JD Vance as weird. And Drew says this.
Somehow the guy who mandates tampons in boys' bathrooms for high schools is not the weird guy.
I
Right?
know,
Like
for fourth grade. That's when it starts.
Elementary
supposed to
school.
start fifth.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too where you've got a framing that relies on what does the average Washington Post or New York Times editor consider weird. I would go so far as to say that perhaps that is not aligned with what most Americans and most voters think is weird. I think people think that's a lot weirder.
Now, that's a bit of bullshit. The tampon Tim thing was a beat up from the Trump campaign. The claim was that Tim Walz was behind a Minnesota law forcing schools to stock tampons in boys' bathrooms, a claim that has been debunked. The law in question doesn't specify gender at all. It just says menstruating students must get access to free menstrual products in a plan left to the school district. Even if some schools were putting tampons in boys' bathrooms, that would be the school district's decision, not Tim Walz's mandate. So I think it was a bit sloppy from Drew to push that line. That said, I do think he's making a good faith effort to do something useful. I've watched a lot of interviews with Drew Holden, and he strikes me as a decent person who just wants the media to be better. And he's doing this kind of as a hobby, basically.
Is that how you view your role? Do you think that that's the sort of the future of the way this is going to work? Media outlets don't employ people like you, so you have to just sort of show up and do it as a public service?
I guess the short answer to your question is yes. I'm trying to provide that public service, right? I do earnestly believe that it needs to happen. I'm doing it as yeoman's work. I'm doing it in my spare time. And so I think it's an important public good. And so I do think that there will probably just, over time end up with more people like me who are spending more time kind of fact checking these things, calling balls and strikes as well as we know how, trying to do that through the lens of public service, because at the end of the day, the trust in the media is bottoming out, right? It's hitting all-time lows left and right. And I think that needs to be fixed. And I'm trying to play a tiny, tiny role in helping that be fixed. And if it can't be fixed internally, then perhaps some external pressure can help move that along.
So, where are we at with my judging criteria? Firstly, can you generally trust that what this person says is factual? Tricky one this time. I want to say mostly yes, but I think he is a little bit loose with the facts sometimes when they suit a conservative narrative. Now, I don't think he's a straight up hack. I just think he could be a little bit more careful and fair. So I think I'm going to have to give him a small fail on that one. Secondly, are they open about their bias, perspective, or incentives? Yes, he's open about the fact that he's a conservative and acknowledges his bias. It's just that I think his bias affects him a little bit. Thirdly, do they offer something of value to the discourse? So this is the big yes for me on Drew. I think it's good and useful that someone is doing this. I think it would be great if someone would do it for the conservative media too. I have no doubt that there would be no shortage of threads you could write about them. Finally, are they accountable? I hate to say it, but not especially. And just to get a little bit meta here, in his thread calling out people who'd shared the story about ivermectin overdoses, Drew called out Health Nerd, who is a science writer that I've actually reviewed previously on my channel. But Drew didn't respond when Health Nerd pointed out that he'd also tweeted that the story wasn't verified fact.
Interesting that in a thread about misinformation, you failed to note the tweets I added almost immediately after the original with precisely what you've pointed out. Guess we're all guilty of a bit of exaggeration for effect.
I guess we are. Overall, despite the problems that I've just pointed out, I do recommend following Drew Holden, just with the caution that I think his conservative bias does sometimes get the better of him, and that I think he can make claims about the media's motivations that are a little bit overblown. I actually especially think he's worth following if you're someone who sits on the left side of politics, because I think it could help you understand the frustrations that many people on the other side of the political spectrum have with the media. I should also mention Drew has a Substack called Holden Court, where he writes more long-form media criticism articles. That's all for now. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you have any suggestions for people you'd like to see me review, feel free to leave them there as well, or to email them to me at theinternetreviewed@gmail.com. I have a spreadsheet where I'm tracking all the potential reviews I can do, and I add every suggestion to that spreadsheet.